and thank you for being here tonight. My name is Valentina Carrera, and I work at the University of Amsterdam. And my task today is just to be your host and moderator. So let me introduce you to this evening. We will start with a short presentation by Brett Christophers, whom I'm sure you all know since you are here. Is the author of The Price is Wrong. Brett is a geographer at the University of Uppsala in Sweden. And as I learned a few minutes ago, Brett is a geographer who has a healthy skepticism about academia and geography in particular. And I think that's one of the reasons why we can enjoy this book, because this has led to a commitment to writing from a broader audience as well about important societal problems, including land enclosure, rentier capitalism, and most recently, the financing of the green transition. After Brett's presentation, we will have a short reading by Koen Haegens from the Groene Amsterdammer, who are also co-sponsoring this event. And then we will have two short responses to Brett's presentation, one by Nicky Pouw. Nicky is an economist, also at the University of Amsterdam, and the author of Wellbeing Economics, who a book that, as the title suggests, also goes in the direction of arguing that we should move away from the obsession with economic growth and towards more human emphasis on well-being. And the second intervention will be by Crelis Rammelt, who is also a colleague from the geography department at the University of Amsterdam. He's a political ecologist and one, I think, of the Dutch leading thinkers about degrowth. So I think this should be a very good discussion, a very good basis for the discussion. And then we will end with a few questions from the audience. Okay, thank you, and leave the stage to Brett.
Thank you, Valentina, and thanks everyone for coming. It really is a privilege and a pleasure to be here, and I can't believe how many people came, and it's really lovely that you all did. So I'm going to talk about the new book. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk for probably about 25 minutes, and I'm going to try and sort of give an overview of the main messages and some of the main themes of the book. And as Valentina said, financing and the financing of green energy is right at the core of the book. But also at the core of the book is electricity. So what I'm going to start with is by talking about why electricity is at the heart of the book. And a lot of this, maybe even all of it, will be very obvious to many of you, but I'm sure it won't be obvious to everyone. And hopefully everyone will get something new out of what I'm saying. But it is important to be clear about why I'm talking and starting at any rate with electricity. So why is electricity so important when we talk particularly about climate? Well, the starting point is that if you think about the various different types of greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change, you obviously have an array of different greenhouse gases, of which the main one is CO2, carbon dioxide, about 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. If you then focus on carbon dioxide, about 75% of carbon dioxide emissions are caused by the combustion of fossil fuels, so oil, gas, and coal. And then if you focus within that main component, so the 75% that's caused by the combustion of fossil fuels, then electricity generation is the biggest component of that. There's obviously other important components as well, but electricity is the core of it. So electricity is at the core of the actually existing climate problem. So that's the first thing to say about why electricity. But the second thing to say, and in a way kind of even more important, is that if electricity is important now, it's going to be even more important in the future. And again, this is in many respects very, very obvious, but it bears emphasizing. And the reason for that is that, for good or for ill, and I'm not taking a position on it one way or another, the powers that be in the world, which is to say the relevant actors in governments, corporations, non-governmental actors and so on, have essentially decided that the way to tackle climate mitigation, the main way to tackle it is electrification. So basically the strategy is that you electrify as much as possibly as you can across transportation, buildings, heating, whatever else it might be, and then you generate that electricity renewably. And obviously it doesn't have to be that way. There are other ways of doing it. So road transportation would be the best example, right? So currently we use, for the most part, internal combustion engine vehicles, where we use petroleum as a fuel. So you have two basic choices for decarbonising that. You can either shift to a hydrocarbon-based fuel, so some kind of biofuel or ethanol or whatever it might be, or you can shift to a battery-driven motor that is based upon electricity, and then you generate the electricity renewably. And that's basically what the world has decided to do for the most part. That's the basic strategy that's been decided, is we electrify and then we generate that electricity through non-carboniferous means. And what that means is that the role of electricity in our overall energy system is going to become more and more important. So if you look, for example, at the International Energy Agency's main scenario for reaching net zero by 2050, it estimates that electricity will go from being roughly about 20% of final energy demand globally, which is roughly where it is now, to 50% by 2050. So they're expecting massive growth in the role of electricity in the overall energy system. So that means that if decarbonising electricity is important because of its role now, it's even more important because of how much more important electricity is going to become in the overall energy system. So that's why I'm focusing in this book and in what I'm going to talk about tonight on specifically on electricity, for good or for ill. That's the focus. But obviously I'm going to be talking a lot about finance as well, because it turns out you can't talk about electricity without talking about finance. So if that's the case, how are we doing? Are we winning on electricity decarbonisation? And I think this is one of those classic questions where it's like, appropriately enough, it's like, is the glass half full or half empty? So if you look at renewables growth, you think we're doing great. So renewables are growing really, really fast, both in terms of investment in renewables capacity and in terms of the amount of electricity that is generated from renewables. However, at the same time, electricity generation from fossil fuels, which is predominantly natural gas and coal, increasingly natural gas, is also still growing. So renewables are growing, but they're not growing fast enough. So even in 2023, you still had ongoing growth, both globally, both in the amount of electricity generated from fossil fuels and therefore also in emissions from electricity generation. So no, we are still failing in the sense that renewables growth has continued to be proven to be completely supplemental to, rather than substitutive of, fossil fuel-based electricity generation. It's growing fast, but it's not growing nearly fast enough. So no, we're not succeeding on that point. One other final point I want to make before moving into the core of what I want to talk about, which is, and it's very, very important, and I would say that as a geographer, but there's huge regional variance in all of this, obviously. So some countries are very far down the road already in terms of decarbonising their electricity systems. Some, for example, were not particularly carboniferous in the first place. South America, for example, much of the electricity has been hydro-generated for a long, long time. France is something like 70% nuclear already. But there are other parts of the world, South Africa, something like 92% still coal-fired electricity generation. India's at about 75% coal. And also various countries within Europe are still very, very coal-dependent. So there's huge regional variation in all of this. So it's very difficult to make generalizations about this. So different countries are at very, very different points on this. And I'm going to come back to that right at the end of the talk. So if that's the challenge that I'm going to be talking about, how has the world been approaching that challenge of decarbonising electricity? So there are two basic things I want to say here. So the first of those is that just as the world's strategy for decarbonisation in general has been electrification for the most part, the strategy for decarbonising electricity is essentially solar and wind. And it's important to sort of say what that's about. So, and the reason, and so in this book I focus predominantly on solar and wind, and I do that not because I necessarily think that solar and wind are the right answer and that we should be focusing on them rather than, say, nuclear. I don't take a particular view on that one way or another. But the world has essentially decided that solar and wind are the answer. And yes, there has been a mini nuclear kind of renaissance in the last couple of years in a couple of countries. But for the most part, we are betting the house on solar and wind. That's the basic reality. And so again, if you look at the IEA's projections for where we're going in the future, they reckon that nuclear will just about hold its share of global electricity generation at about 9 to 10%. Hydro, they think, will continue to grow in absolute terms, but actually fall a bit in relative terms from about 14 down to maybe 12% by 2050. And so all the growth in relative terms is expected to come from solar and wind. So that's the basic strategy. And so that's why I focus on solar and wind, because that's what the world is focusing on. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and just as important, is that for the most part, and there are certainly important regional exceptions, which I'll be happy to talk about later, China being the most obvious example of this, for the most part, the world has essentially, or governments have essentially turned to the private sector and said, we are expecting you to do this. Like, it's basically, the problem has been essentially outsourced to the private sector. It's been outsourced to capital, for the most part, which doesn't mean that governments don't do anything. It doesn't mean that governments just kind of stand back and say, it's over to you, we're not going to do anything. That's not true. They put in place regulations for how electricity markets function and things like that. And more importantly still, all around the world, they provide various forms of support and support mechanisms, subsidies in particular, to provide incentives to the private sector to undertake that investment in solar and wind, and those range from the tax credits in the US that are very well, widely talked about, to various forms of long-term revenue guarantees in Europe is much more common in the form of things like feed-in tariffs and feed-in premia. But that's the government role. So the government is saying, we're expecting you to do it, we'll provide incentives of various kinds, but we're typically not going to do it ourselves. So if you look at, in the last 5 years or so, if you look at the shares of renewables investment around the world that are privately owned rather than owned by the state directly or indirectly, in rich countries it's something like 95% private sector, whereas in China it's the exact opposite. So in China, 95% of wind development, for example, in China in recent years has been by state-owned companies, which to one extent or another are tools of central or provincial governments in China. But for the most part in the world, it's over to the private sector. So that's what I wanted to say about how the world has been approaching it. So if that's the case, why is it the case that we're still not winning in this? Why are we still falling behind on chasing that what is actually a movable target in terms of the amount of fossil fuel generated electricity that has to be substituted? Why are we not winning? Now, where I want to start with in answering that question is with the most common answer that is given to that, which today is that the reason we are not winning comes down to kind of a combination of policy, planning type factors and politics type factors. So the argument will be, well, the problem is red tape in getting grid connections. It takes too long. Going through the planning system to get the permits to develop the new wind and solar farms takes too long. There's obstructionism from whether it be kind of not in my backyard communities around the world, to the fossil fuel interests around the world, to enabling the development of renewables to happen as fast as we need it to. Whatever the particular argument is, it's anything but the economics. And what I mean by that is that the argument there is that the economics of the renewables transition has essentially been solved, and I'll talk in a second about what I mean by that. But basically, the argument is that the challenges that remain, the obstacles that remain, are of a economic nature. And it's that argument that I'm kind of taking on in the book. And I'm not arguing. What I'm not doing is saying those other arguments are wrong. No, they all absolutely are important. There are challenges and obstacles and hurdles in the realm of politics and planning and obstructions of those kinds, absolutely. But there's also still an economic problem. So the basic argument that has been that gets made about this, and interestingly, you hear it just as much from the left as you do from the right, is that essentially the economic obstacle historically was the cost of generating electricity renewably through solar and wind compared to the cost of generating it by burning gas or coal. So the argument there was that we have this huge economic problem, which is that it costs much more to generate electrical power through solar and wind than it does from coal and gas. And therefore the policy challenge was to support renewable energy to enable that inherent cost disadvantage to be offset and eventually to be overcome. And the way that narrative continues is to say that that's what happened, and investment occurred and it got scaled up, and the cost of those solar and wind technologies came down significantly, which they did, until a point in the kind of mid-2010s or so, where actually the lifetime average cost of generating electricity from solar and wind reached parity with the cheapest of fossil fuels. And actually since then has for the most part been cheaper, or roughly about the same. And the argument then was, we've solved the economics. It was a cost problem, it was a relative cost of generation problem, and now we've solved the economic issue. The only obstacles that remain are of a non-economic nature. And the argument I make in the book is that that's simply not true, and that the reason why we get it wrong is that by focusing on the cost of generation, we're focusing on essentially the wrong thing, and that actually what we should be focusing on is the profitability of renewables. And yes, obviously the cost of generation has a connection to the profitability, and which I can talk about more later. But basically, the argument in the book is that when you look at profitability, and of course this matters because we live in a capitalist system where the private sector is ruled by the profit motive, what you actually find about the renewables business, the business of developing and then owning and operating wind and solar farms and selling the electricity that they generate, that the profitability of that is A, incredibly volatile and very, very difficult to predict, and secondly, actually not very high. It's kind of a shitty business. And that's a real problem when we're kind of relying on the private sector globally to do that, because the private sector, for the most part, doesn't really like not very profitable businesses. So in the end, it's actually a relatively simple argument that the book is actually making, that we're in a system dominated by profits, and this one thing that we really need the private sector to do, unfortunately, is not a great business and not particularly attractive. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that, and I'll focus on the low profitability part of the argument. But the volatility part of the argument is also very, very important, and they're absolutely connected. But the issue here is that electricity prices, the price at which you're selling your product, are unbelievably volatile. I don't know of any other entity, any other commodity, any other product where there's such a degree of volatility. And not only is it incredibly volatile, but it's impossible to predict. Anyone that can tell you that they can predict electricity prices is lying. People typically can't predict them a month ahead, let alone a year or 10 years ahead. And if you're developing a wind or solar farm, it's a particular type of economic project where essentially all the costs are up front. Once it's operational, there are essentially no costs. There's no fuel, a little bit of maintenance cost now and then. So all the costs essentially are up front. But then obviously the revenues are earned over the lifetime of that project. And it might take, depending on the electricity price, it might take 20, 15, a minimum of 10 years for those upfront costs to be repaid. Now, if you are a developer of a wind or solar farm and you go to a banker and say, I would like to borrow $200 million to finance this wind or solar farm, the banker will say, well, how are you going to make money? And you'll say, well, I'm going to sell electricity. And they say, how much are you going to sell it for the next 15 years? And you say, I have no idea. because no one can tell. They're not going to lend you the money. And that's a massive problem. And so one of the key things in the electricity industry has been the development of a suite of mechanisms to militate against that volatility, of which government support mechanisms are one, but only one variety. So the volatility of profitability is a huge problem when it comes to financing. And what you learn when you research this business is, like so many other businesses, it's actually not the businesses themselves that make the decisions about whether the investments go ahead or not. It's the financiers standing behind them that make the ultimate decisions. So it always comes down to the finance. So that's the volatility thing. The low profitability side is interesting. So you, and again, intuitively, you would think, well, hang on a second. If the cost of generating electricity from solar and wind has come down, and it's actually cheaper than it is than generating electricity from fossil fuels, you would think, well, surely the profits are higher, and that this is going to be an attractive proposition. But there's actually much more to it to that, and I want to talk about three of the. There's a whole other set of things here, but I'm going to focus on three things to try to explain some of this and bring it to light. So, first of those is that you have to focus on like what the industry looks like, and increasingly, so electricity in the past, in most countries around the world, it used to be vertically integrated, which and all that means is that kind of one company did the whole thing. In the UK, it was called the Central Electricity Generating Board. People of my generation have a vague memory of it. And they did everything. They generated the electricity, they owned and controlled the networks through which that electricity is transmitted and distributed, and they sold it to the households and business. They did everything. These days, electricity typically doesn't look like that. You have a separate generating sector, you have a transmission entity, you have local distribution networks, and of course then you have the retailers who connect to the consumers and to the businesses that buy electricity. And the thing about the generating sector, and particularly the renewable generating sector, the companies who are in the business of generating electricity, is that it's incredibly competitive, and there is almost no market power or monopoly power, very, very limited barriers to entry. So what that means is that it's incredibly competitive, and say that the generating sector discovers a new method of generating electricity that turns out to be cheaper, like, say, solar and wind, they think, okay, we'll switch to that because we'll make more money if we switch to it. But unless generators have the power to capture those cost reductions, then it makes no sense for them to do that, because those cost reductions simply get passed down the supply chain to other parts of the supply chain, and ultimately even to consumers, maybe not in their totality, but in significant part. And that's the reality in the electricity world, is that it's very, very difficult for generators to capture any incremental cost efficiencies that they have, because they just don't have the market power. Electricity doesn't have an OPEC, for example. It doesn't have a cartel which basically fixes prices in the global electricity market. There's proper competition in that sector, and competition means an inability to capture those cost reductions. So that's one thing. So competition is incredibly important. And what you actually find is the way electricity markets are designed and the way that government support mechanisms are designed tend to exacerbate that competition rather than offset it. Think about the reverse auctions through which electricity contracts are offered and tendered to electricity companies across Europe. They exacerbate rather than militate against that competition. The second thing to think about in terms of the profitability is that electricity is not just electricity. And what I mean by this, so often you'll hear that electricity generated by sun or the wind is exactly the same as electricity generated by coal or gas. And yes, it is. An electron is just an electron is just an electron. However, different types of electricity generated by different types of operator have different degrees of revenue potential. And so what I mean by that is this, which is to say that, say you have a solar farm on the one hand and a natural gas-fired plant on the other, and say they generate exactly the same amount of electricity over the exact same period, say a week, a day, or a month, and say they actually are able to sell, not just produce, but able to sell exactly the same amount of electricity over that period. That does not mean that they generate the same amount of revenue, because one, go back to what I said earlier about the volatility of electricity prices. One could be generating its electricity disproportionately at times of the day, week or month when electricity is very, very cheap because it's very, very abundant. And the other one could be generating its electricity at times of the day, month or week when electricity is very, very expensive, peak times, because it's in scarce supply. And what you find, obviously, when you look at different types of electricity generator is that they have completely different production profiles. So even if they're producing the same amount over the same period, one can be producing very valuable electricity and one can be producing very, very unvaluable electricity. And what you find with solar and wind is that they produce disproportionately non-revenue generative power. So the fact that they are producing that power more cheaply might make no difference in terms of profitability if they can't make much money from selling it. So that's the second thing to think about, is the revenue potential of it. Third thing, and kind of my favourite because it's really geographical, is that a generating company's costs are not just the cost of generating the electricity, right? So when you get your electricity bill at home and you're paying your power invoice, that bill is made up essentially of two main things. It's the cost of the electricity being produced, but it's also the cost of that electricity being distributed from where it is produced to where you are consuming it. And the thing that's really, really significant here is that wherever you look in the world, whether it's China, whether it's the US, whether it's India, whether it's Germany, whether it's Sweden, whether it's the UK, one of the features that you see over and over and again in all those places is that solar and wind farms are located disproportionately in places where people don't live. They are located completely at the other end of those countries. And there's a good reason for that, right? Which is that one of the main costs of a solar or wind farm, is the land that is needed for that. They are very, very land-intensive entities. And obviously land is much cheaper where people don't live. In Wyoming, I think the average cost of an acre of land is like 1% of the average cost of an acre of land in New Jersey, for example. So of course, that's where solar and wind farms are located. But what that means is that solar and wind farms, compared to conventional power plants, which we kind of know intuitively are much more closely located to where people live, in part because they don't take up so much space, but they've always been, that's because they were built with that in mind. Solar and wind farms they exert a much higher burden on the transmission and distribution system of electricity, on the grid, than conventional power plants do, to get that electricity from where it's produced to where it's consumed. And the people that run the grid try very, very hard to make generating companies bear the cost of their own locational decisions. So they don't do it perfectly by any means, but if you, in Sweden, for example, most people live in the south, if you decide to set up your wind farm in the north where land is very, very cheap, the regulator will basically try to make you bear the cost of that decision. And so as a generator, it might be cheaper now, as all the graphs tell us, to produce that power than it is for a gas plant. But the overall cost, if you include things like the transportation cost, the delivery cost, might be much, much higher. And all the graphs that the electricity market analysts put out there, like, oh, look at how cheap solar and wind are, completely ignore those other sets of costs. It's all about the generating cost. And of course, that generating cost is low precisely because they're located where land is cheap. So it's an artificially low cost in that case. So again, that's the third reason that profitability and generating costs really do not align with one another. So I'm gonna. That's the last thing I want to say about that. So two more things I want to talk about. So that's the basic set of arguments in the book. Is that profit-wise, this is a very, very tenuous business. Returns on average over the long term tend to be somewhere around 5 to 8%, which, when you can get 6% just putting your money in treasuries right now, is not a particularly attractive economic proposition. So if that's the case, what could one might do to hasten the decarbonisation of electricity? I'm only going to go for another 2 or 3 minutes, then I'm done. How could this be resolved if any of this analysis that I have is right, that profitability is this kind of live and almost existential problem for the decarbonisation of electricity? Well, there are basically 3 kind of answers out there, I think. And And not surprisingly, those answers are associated with different interest groups. So the first kind of answer out there, and this is the one that you tend to hear from, I guess, what I would describe as orthodox energy economists, mainstream energy economists, the likes that advise governments, is that it's all a problem of market design. So what they say is that the problem is not that this is in the hands of the private sector. And the problem is not that we're buying and selling electricity through markets. The problem is that we haven't got the markets right. And in fact, the problem is not that we have markets, it's the problem is that we don't have enough markets. So we haven't optimized those markets. So the problem is not less market. The solution is not less markets. The solution is more markets. It's always more markets. It's about getting the market right. It's about getting the signals right and making sure those signals are not obscured by government interventions of various kinds. It's the classic, for want of a better word, neoliberal argument, which is that the answer to problems caused by markets, potentially caused by markets, is always not less markets but more markets. And there's a whole discourse out there about how we best might redesign markets. There was a lot of enthusiasm for that redesign during the peak of the electricity crisis a couple of years ago. We all remember in Europe, once electricity prices came back down, everyone forgot that they wanted to redesign the markets, and it's not happening for a whole set of interesting reasons that I'm happy to get into. So that's the first answer, market redesign. Second answer, and this is the answer you hear from the industry, the big generating companies, the big investment companies that own lots of wind farms, like BlackRock. If you drive around Sweden, where I live, like half the wind farms in the middle of the nowhere in the wilderness are owned by BlackRock. The answer from them is more subsidy. Essentially, keep it in the private sector, but just boost the subsidies so that it's profitable enough for us to want to invest. So instead of having subsidies that produce profits of 5 to 8%, let's bump them up, and so we can get 10, 11, 12, 13%, and then the investment will flow in. And actually, that's kind of what the Inflation Reduction Act was, essentially, in the US. That's basically what it was, which was that the US had been attenuating the subsidies, the tax credits that it supplies to wind and solar operators. It had been bringing them down from 30% to 22% to 18%, and so on. And it kind of realised, oh shit, investment's collapsing, let's take them back to 30% to basically underpin profitability. They didn't say that's what they were doing, but that's what they were doing. Absolutely. So that's the second answer. Bigger subsidies forever from the public sector. And then the third answer, which is essentially the one that you get from the left, which is to say, look, the private sector's had its chance. It still isn't really working, even though the cost of the technologies have come down, and even though there are still subsidies in place everywhere in the world. People will talk about zero support renewables, but it doesn't exist. It really doesn't exist. Subsidies exist everywhere in significant form. And so the argument there is that the private sector is still not really doing it. Maybe the public sector should try to do it instead. And so that's the kind of third answer that's out there, and you hear that a lot. So the Labour Party, one of its things that it's saying in the UK is it will have a public renewables generator, tiny, insignificant, but they're kind of saying it. And that's the third answer. So that's all I'll say about the answers. Last thing I want to say is to go back to the point I made at the beginning, which is about the geography and where different countries are at in the transition. And all I want to say there is that the reality with this, and I think it's an important thing to think about, is that what happens in places like the Netherlands or the UK or Sweden or even the US, actually, in many respects, is not insignificant, but it's much less significant to the future of the global emissions profile in terms of electricity, but also in terms of other things, than what happens elsewhere in the world. And there's obvious, and so if you think about electricity, there's two big reasons for that. So the first is that much as there are problems with Europe and North America, Europe and North America, on average, are further along the decarbonisation path of electricity than most countries in Africa, most countries in Asia, some countries in Latin America, but certainly Africa and Asia. I gave some of the figures earlier, but India 75% coal, China 65% coal, Nigeria 90% coal, South Africa 92% coal. Big countries, big populations, and not only are they much more dependent on fossil fuels still, but that's where the large bulk of global growth in electricity consumption is going to occur in the future. Because per capita consumption of electricity at the moment is minuscule in those countries, India is still connecting hundreds of millions of homes to electricity for the first time every year. And so those are the countries where, A, there's more to be done in terms of decarbonisation, and B, that's where electricity growth is going to be predominantly located. So that means that what happens there is disproportionately significant in terms of the global emissions profile. And the last thing I'll say on that point is that that's where the profitability challenges are kind of greatest, because the cost of finance to develop renewables in those parts of the world is multiple times higher, because the financial institutions that dominate global capital provision perceive those countries, rightly or wrongly, to be much more risky, and the cost of the capital associated with it is 3 or 4 times greater than it would be in Europe. So the places that are most important are where the profitability hurdles appear to be greatest, and the financing challenges therefore greatest as well. I've run over by about 5 minutes, I'm sorry about that, but I'm done now.
Good evening. I will read a column. So 4 months ago, I visited my native village in the south of the country, and it was for a report on the election campaign. And as we say in the Netherlands, I fell with my nose in the butter. More precise, in a heated political battle about windmills. It was during a municipal council meeting. The proponents pointed, of course, to climate change, to the subsequent need for clean energy, to the fact that the village had yet barely contributed anything to that transition, and to the vastness of the place where the windmills were to be built. Few farms, houses, hundreds and hundreds of meters away, and nothing else. So you won't find it much more deserted in Holland. Then the opponents of the windmills, who were present en masse, they obviously did not agree with this. During the break, they told me they feared for sleepless nights, for the health of the trees and the plants they were growing, because they would suffer from the shadow of the windmill blades, and they feared for the migrant workers working and living on their property. Or better, they were afraid that the migrant workers would leave and work somewhere else, for somebody else. Now, you shouldn't think that the opponents were not constructive in this debate. There was the party most on the right in the local council. They even presented an alternative. And the alternative was small nuclear power plants. It sounds cute, right? Small nuclear power plants. Just 4 of these things, they had calculated that. Just 4 of them, and the municipality would already be finished with the energy transition. And okay, then you can say that technology isn't much further than a drawing board. And personally, for me, it's still not clear to me why citizens who really hate wind turbines would accept a nuclear power plant the size of a toddler in their backyard, which I assume also needs to be strictly secured with hordes of soldiers and masses of barbed wire because the Russians are coming. But anyway, given the quality of these arguments, you will understand which camp won the discussion. No windmills in my village. Exactly. So let me explain what all this, I think, has to do with tonight's topic. I want to talk about the remarkable role of the government. It is she, as Brett already emphasizes in his book, the government who in many cases provides the subsidies for these projects, these types of projects. Government must also designate, like in my village, the location where the wind turbines and the solar parks will be built. They must issue the permits. In short, the government seems everywhere. And this applies even more to the rest of the energy sector. The network operators, they are in the hands of a national, provincial, local government. Energy supplier like Vattenfall, it's a Swedish state-owned company. And those new nuclear power plants, the big ones, not the child ones, the big ones in Borselen that everybody's now going to talk about in Dutch politics, if, and I say if, it happens this time, after many, many, many proposals in that direction, it will only happen because there is one party who donates a huge bag of money, which is, again, our good old government. So energy, in short, is already at least a semi-public sector, I think, just as the banks. If things go wrong, the state stands ready to bail them out. That's what happened in 2008 with the credit crunch, and that's also what happened in the energy crisis in 2021, 2023. Germany, for example, saved Uniper, the big energy company, from collapse with tens of billions of euros of tax money. In the Netherlands, there was the maximum price for energy, het energieplafond, as we call it, and we still have the energietoeslag, the energy surcharge. Important measures, and I totally agree with them, absolutely, but they're also a kind of easy insurance for energy companies, just in case clients can't pay their bills. It's easy. So there's only one thing, or one important thing here that our government does not directly interfere with. And that's, like Brett was explaining, the pace of the energy transition. Ultimately, that's up to the market, whoever that may be. And the irony here is, I think, what Brett was describing sounded like the ultimate fantasy of Adam Smith. Finally, a market that's working like it should work. Like, so much competition, there is no profit anymore left. Well, and then it has to be this one market that we don't want to function. Anyway, I think it's weird. It's like I would sponsor the purchase of a bus with my own money. And I would also say, like, hey, I will build your roads. And I will build the bridges that the bus has to drive on. And I will guarantee that the driver has enough passengers in the bus. And of course, if something really breaks, you know, just send the bill to me. I will pay it. I will pay the damage. But then in the end, when everything's there, I hand over the two most important things. Here's the steering wheel, here's the gas pedal. I don't need it. You can do it. So why would anybody do that? The conclusion to me seems obvious. Is an economic activity so important that it must be saved with public money if necessary? Then as a government you have to take back control. If you don't trust private companies and investors to save the climate, not because there are bad people, of course not, but because they might have different interests, like making obscene amounts of profit, maybe you should do it yourself. Now, of course, there are many alternatives to nationalization. You can try to influence private investment decisions by providing even more subsidies. It was already said, for a much longer time, subsidies forever. You can also make the mega profits of fossil energy producers shrink by suing them, for example, for destroying the planet, or a bit more simple by making a way higher carbon tax on it. I guess we'll be hearing a bit more about these alternatives in a minute, but for now I want to go back one last time to my village. Thanks to Brett, I understand now 3 things about what I saw there. First, these kind of discussions, no matter how much we hear and read about them in the media, are not the biggest obstacle in the fight against climate change. And in a way, that's a relief, I think. Secondly, if wind turbines were as profitable as oil, for example, they would have been there for a long time ago in my village. 0 complaints about noise or about my view is spoiled now. If it yields enough, and if the locals share also in the profit, I think even the most skeptical farmer over there would be cheering. An oil well in front of my kitchen window, please, come in there, give it to me. And the third and last lesson is that even if private parties are in charge, the public anger about wind turbines and solar panels will still be directed to the government. That shitstorm is coming anyway, see my village. So then you might as well take it into your own hands. And I promise that unlike Shell and Chevron, me as a civilian, as a citizen, and a taxpayer, I will be very grateful for my meager return of 6%. Thank you.
Thanks, Koen. Are you from Groningen or Middenmeer? Oh, down. Okay, that's also possible. Thanks. Brett, I was asked to be the discussant of your book, and I always appreciate colleagues who try to reach a broader audience. It almost requires you to unlearn academic language and find a new language to bring across your message and analysis. And I think, yeah, you did a great job. I really buy into the analysis of this topic. I'm going to make a few comments. I have done a very simple analysis of the core arguments in your book. Using the following abbreviations. Have a quick look, because then we move on to the economic equations. The most important ones are the fossil fuels, of course, renewable energy, price, supply, quantity, and costs. A very simple analysis, of course. The core argument of Brett is that despite the relative price of renewable energy, or the cost of renewable energy are going down, the price is going down, this is not leading to the green energy transition as mainstream economics would predict. And this is because, although we see an increase in production of renewables, there is still a much higher increase in the supply of fossil fuels. So, and this is driven by profits, as you say, and not by this relative price trends. So that if we have price times quantity minus the cost, let's say the total cost of fossil fuels, it is still very much higher than the profits made by the renewables. And this is driven by the private production cost differences, the problem of volatility, and of course location also matters, as you explain. The yellow circle has to be around the cost of fossil fuels. This is a misrepresentation of the true cost. As you argue in your book, social cost, environmental cost are not included in the price, and that's why profit margins can stay so high. If we did true pricing, the picture would look different, of course. So, hence your title, The Price is Wrong. Profits are calculated on the basis of private production costs only, social environmental costs not included, and this is why you argue the price is wrong. Brett's analysis, as he explained, in my view, focuses a lot on the supply side of things, and you really unpack in great detail the electricity sector and all the important changes taking place there, the increase in renewable energy that is primarily driven by wind and solar, the fossil fuel production still increasing, especially in countries like China, Nigeria, India, you name it. Of course, what is behind this is the huge increase in demand for electricity. I mean, humanity is asking for more energy. And urbanization, industrialization, population growth, and households wanting to be connected to the grid to begin with is, of course, pushing this trend. You explain the geographic patterns, and you make oftentimes reference to that this is a story about China and India and a number of other newly emerging economies and developing countries. And we are failing to close this emissions and implementation gap. So how to resolve then the externality? Is it a utopia that there comes a day that profits in renewables can maybe exceed the profits in fossil fuels? I don't know. The political economy of that is an interesting lens to look through. It should not come as a surprise that subsidies are the so-called easy tool to work with, because it's very difficult to imagine or to realize that we can tax fossil fuels easily or that we put quantity limits. I hope it is possible one day, but it's not happening. And politically, this is, of course, much, much more difficult. unless there is a much stronger counter movement that pushes for this. And you make reference to an historical example of the 1930s in the US where this, more or less also happened. I wanted to raise 2 points for discussion. I hope we can also open that up with the floor. I do think that the focus on the supply side is very insightful, and it has led to this very thick book. But I was wondering, do we know all that is happening on the demand side? There's also a lot to unpack there, and I feel it is a bit under highlighted. And what can be done more on the demand side? Within high-income countries, we see wind parks being built on massive scales. Also in the Netherlands, there have been protests in Groningen and in Middenmeer and in the south of Holland. Yet these wind parks are being built, but what is the green energy produced used for? It is often used for big data storage companies. So that is not helping the transition to a green economy. And then the whole debate on the right to development. If I communicate with my colleagues in Africa, in policy, in public policy, in the private sector, they need energy. They need the demand is indeed staggering, and they claim this right to development, and they're really struggling, how to deal with these difficult trade-offs between, on the one hand, the need to be connected to the grid, to have light in the evening to study, for children to study their school books, social development that is associated to that, and then the environmental cost of that. Is there a role for high-income countries to play there, to take responsibility, to feel indebted to that, or to compensate? I'm really curious about your opinion for that. I want to close off by asking you if you can write a next book on the demand side, and then answer the question if the trend that you are describing to us in this book is really driven by capitalism or by humanity. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation to speak here. Thank you, Brett. Congratulations with the book. It's a fantastic analysis. It's really amazing, very powerful, and like you said, simple message, but it's so convincing. It's really in depth, incredibly, engaging with the complexity and all the diversity of cases around the world. And I'm amazed that you managed to sort of see the forest through the trees. I sometimes got lost reading it, but incredible work. My comment I can't really say anything about the content of the book, but my comment is more about something that for me flows from it, and it flows also from one of the last comments you made just now, where you say, well, how are we going to navigate out of this problem? So we either have more markets, we either have more subsidies, or nationalize, right? These are the three options. And I'm wondering why not post-growth as a fourth one, and because the three that you mentioned, they all have in common that things must continue to grow. And so I wanted to just emphasize that and talk a little bit about the implications of that growth, if I may, and then get your thoughts on that, if possible, if there's time for that. So we need, and we can talk about land, we could talk about all the electric gadgets that we have lying around our houses and stuff like that, but I want to talk about minerals, a thing that I think also for me flowed out very much from the book, thinking, okay, let's talk about minerals, the copper for the transmission cables, the lithium for the batteries and the storage, all of that. So I'm going to show 3 slides with some evidence. The first one is this. It basically tells us that the current rates of production of all these minerals that we need for renewable energy is way too slow. So The first column is an estimate of the amount of these different minerals that we need for just one generation of renewable technologies to replace fossil fuels. And the second column is the current rate of mineral extraction. So you divide the first by the second, and you get the number of years that we would need to actually extract this amount of that we need, right? So we need about 10,000 years to mine enough lithium to get just one generation of renewables, right? And the average lifetime is like 20 years or something like that. So after 20 years, we recycle something, but we can't recycle everything, so we need to go out and mine again. 200 years for copper. So really, we need to ramp up mining fast, right? No matter the environmental consequences. Then the second one is, and we need to ramp it up even faster than we think because of this thing called the energy return on energy invested. This is my formula for the night. It's basically the amount of energy that you need to put in. The amount of energy that you can get from an installation divided by the amount of energy that you had to put in to get the energy out for us to use, right? That's one sort of basic definition. There are multiple definitions out there of this EROI. And this study, the references below, it sort of shows us the fall in EROI if we move towards renewable. If we actually replace fossil fuels more and more with renewable energy. So the energy return on energy investment for renewable energy sources is much lower than for fossil fuels currently. It's changing for both, but this is an estimate of the drop that we would have, which essentially means that maybe we need 3 or 4 power plants, renewable power plants, just to compensate for sort of phasing out one fossil fuel-based power plant, right? Just to get the same energy services. We need more power plants to do that. So again, we need to ramp up mining faster and more of those minerals to even get there. So that's just to replace fossil fuels, let alone to have growth, right? Growth of consumption of energy that we want in the current system. And that leads, obviously, you probably see it coming, to limits, right? Limits to these renewables. This is, on the left column, the same estimates of what we need as before for one generation of renewables. And the second one is the known reserves. There's a lot of uncertainty here. The authors say that they sort of try to be optimistic. But even if you double this, you still have only 20% of known copper reserves out there relative to compared to what we need for just one generation of renewables. And then we can get into this long discussion about recycling, finding substitutes and things like that. But this is based on current technologies, and it would take time, to change these technologies and to find the proper mines, to develop those mines. So there's a whole discussion we can have around that too. I won't do that now. I will say one more thing about this is that we face other problems before we actually reach these hard limits. All the easy accessible mines of these ores have already been discovered and already been emptied. So now we are getting to the mines that are more difficult to extract ores from. The ores themselves are not as pure. We need more energy to sort of get the minerals out of there. So more energy is needed as we sort of approach like the limits of these reserves out there. And we discover new reserves, of course, as well. So to me, I understand in the book there's this one sentence, of course, that you have doubts about this degrowth narrative. And I understand that, politically very difficult to imagine. So I fear you're right, but I hope you're wrong. But then it leads to the next one is, okay, if we're not going to have a deliberate process of downscaling, planned process of downscaling, because that's politically unfeasible, we will have a forced downscaling of energy use and consumption because of these reasons. And so I find more hope actually in this story of degrowth and the story of sufficiency, where, for example, the group in Leeds University that are studying the decent living energy standards, right? So we can do with much less, have a decent life with much less. And it's not about returning, back to the caves. It's thinking about, do we need like this electric pepper grinder or whatever, right? So it's not like that. You could think about, so one of the things I conclude is that we could have by 2050 decent access to energy, everyone, that would be at the same level as we had, the energy use that we had in the 60s. So definitely not back to the caves, right? And that would mean if we have a proper redistribution, that would mean that billions of people that currently don't even have minimum decent access to energy would have it. So redistribution again. So with that, I'll finish. And I just want to sort of, I think, of course, that idea of sufficiency is completely incompatible with capitalism. So I think I want to underscore your subtitle a bit more and say why capitalism won't save us. I think that's one thing that I would like to emphasize, especially, and particularly sort of the growth compulsion that's embedded in capitalism. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, there's lots to think about there, and I'm going to do a very unsatisfactory job of responding to it, partly because I'm just tired from focusing. But I mean, the first thing and most important thing I want to say is thank you so much to all three of you. It's a rare but real privilege and honour to have your work read seriously and taken seriously. So thank you. The first thing, I guess, I'm going to just say two or three things. So the first thing is the point about the role of the West out in places where essentially electricity consumption is way lower, and the need for growth in energy consumption is obviously much higher. I mean, to me that kind of it completely goes without saying that it's essential. And actually, I know from having talked to people in those countries, when you talk about the energy transition, they kind of laugh and they're like, well, let's think about energy access first before energy transition. That's the kind of key concern. So it's laughable when you talk about energy transition. All I'll say there is so the outgoing editor of the outgoing energy editor of the Financial Times, they changed their energy editor recently. When he left at the end of last year to take up a new position in the FT, he wrote a piece where he said, it still amazes me that the question of whether the West should be stumping up the money to finance the energy transition now is even questioned. So he was like, of course. And so if even the FT energy editor is saying that, you know what I mean? It's like, of course. Yeah, that's the only way. It's the only, given the fiscal constraints under which poor country governments operate, absolutely, yeah, for sure, that has to be financed. And there's basic, kind of ethical carbon budget reasons that are completely fundamental to that. On the demand question, one thing that's really ironic, and this kind of almost speaks to the kind of absurd contradictions of capitalism, that point that you mentioned about what that energy is being used for in, say, in terms of data centers, is that yes, it's being used to drive incredibly energy-intensive data centers, but increasingly, it's only those data centers that are actually getting the renewables projects financed in the first place. So the only way that the developers can raise money from banks is by saying to the banks, Amazon has promised to buy our electricity at a fixed price for the next 12 years, and then that's the way they get financed. So it's unbelievably contradictory, but that's how Amazon's driving our energy transition increasingly, which is again completely absurd, but again tells you a lot. And then the bigger questions on the demand side that both of you raised, of course, post-growth is the other, and in a sense, the most sensible answer. But you're completely right that the reason I don't go there is, to me, it's just politically unimaginable. It's the one thing that I just cannot see is that people in the West, where it's obviously not outside the West, it's in particular if you look at being an electricity nerd now, if you look at electricity consumption per capita, the US is off the clock. We think we use a lot of electricity in Europe, but we're nothing compared to North. It's insane the amount of electricity that they consume on average in the US. and the idea that there is going to be a degrowth in that consumption is just so unimaginable to me. But of course, that has to be and I think you're also right that it's going to happen somehow. It is either going to happen in a planned way or not, or it's going to happen for all those reasons, but a whole host of other reasons you talk about. And the last thing I'll say is that when you said that, it reminded me of this great review piece that Adam Tooze wrote about Andreas Malm's work in the London Review of Books a couple of years ago, where he took Malm's work really seriously, which kind of surprised me, given who he is and given his kind of liberal tendencies and everything. And at the end of it, and he even took seriously the How to Blow Up a Pipeline book, and he was basically saying the reason to take it serious, and to Malm's argument there, is that we need violence now against property, against fossil fuel property, to hasten the transition, right? That's his argument essentially. And Tooze's point was a kind of a parallel to your point, which is that violence is coming, like it or not, in one way or another. And he didn't say it, but his basic premise was rather property violence now than other violence later. And it's kind of the same point, I think. And I think he's right. But it's just, to me, it's like that's the one thing that won't. And the point, and I will say one more thing quickly. The point that you asked about, is it humanity or is it unfortunately, I've become increasingly negative view about humanity, unfortunately. And I'll tell you a story actually, which was like, and not least within academia, and not least within kind of leftist academia. Someone was telling me about a university, I think it was in the Netherlands actually, it will go unnamed, where apparently they did this thing where they tried to implement this scheme to encourage people to fly less, academics who fly way too much for the most part, particularly senior academics. And so what they did was they tried to shame people they put up a list of how much people were flying, and it had the obverse effect because people flew more to try and go up the list.
So I will now take a few questions from the audience, but I will start by saying our time is very limited. We need to free the venue very soon. So I will take 3 questions, and I will take them all at once. And I ask you to please be brief so there is time to answer them. Otherwise, we might have to leave without... one here. I will come with the mic. One here. I will pick one slightly more to the back for fairness.
If you take 3, we can ignore any really difficult ones.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Ajay. My question is for you. You spoke about, at the end, the third solution was public versus private financing. And it seems like there's a beautiful natural experiment. There are both cases happening right now in the world, like you mentioned. Like China is doing the public financing, and everywhere else is private financing is what's trying to solve this. So which one is working better? It seems like we might have the data for this. It'd be nice to know how they actually compare.
Okay. I can answer that one quickly, actually, just before. Right now, it's pretty obvious which one's working better. So sorry about that. There was lots of fanfare around the fact that last year global investment in renewables capacity, new renewables capacity, increased 50% on the year before. Massive increase on the year before. And what nobody mentioned, except in like footnotes, was that 80% of that growth increase was in China. 80%. So essentially the rest of the world didn't really progress at all. And the IEA has upgraded its forecast for the next 5 years by a huge amount. 90% of that increment is China. Yeah. But that raises all sorts of questions, right? But the reality is but China's also building new coal-fired plants at a rapid pace as well. So it's not like it's just doing renewables.
And they're going do that public, but also choosing private models also.
Yeah.
Well, I can actually shift the mic now to him because I had exactly the same question.
Okay, excellent. Cooperative.
Nou maar eerst achterin, dan doe ik het laatst.
Okay.
Thank you for your insights. I was wondering, so given that we know post-growth is unimaginable, if I would have to force you to make it imaginable, how would you go about it?
Can you answer that quickly?
That's a question for you.
We'll talk about it. There's no time.
Well, I'm completely naive about these things. I don't think about those questions at all. But presumably, eventually, what will happen is some form of rationing. I would imagine. Yeah, and of course, we have rationing right now through the market, through money, but we don't call it rationing. But I would imagine that's what will when the shit really hits the fan. There'll be some form of rationing, presumably. People writing about degrowth don't like the word rationing because it raises lots of hackles, but yeah.
This is a perfect bridge because we have also elections here and the outcome they ignore. How long will it take? They prefer to have an extra, if it's depending on an extra airport, or there's no problem with climate. So we will produce more and demand more everything. But your figures are worldwide. So how long does it take till we hit the wall? That there's nothing less anymore.
That's a good question. I don't know exactly how long it would take, but I think that the science already there with this, also for fossil fuels, the sort of falling energy return on energy investment. We already see that happening a lot. We need to go for other sources that are more difficult to access. When exactly then we run out, we don't really know. For a lot of these minerals, we don't know whether we are already sort of past the peak or not. That's a big discussion of where we are, I think. But I think from this sort of post-growth perspective, the logic is, well, it is going to happen sooner or later, and whether it is 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years from now that certain things run out, that doesn't really, well, it matters because we would like to have some time to plan ahead, but yeah, we don't know exactly. That would be my short answer.
Was this,
If there is one question from someone who didn't speak, yeah.
Hi, you briefly mentioned the cost of externalities as a way to increase or decrease the profitability of fossil fuels. From my kind of layman's view, it seems like that's kind of an arbitrarily set number. Nobody wants to actually pay the cost of the environmental damage because then your economy becomes less competitive on the global market. So at what point do the costs of those externalities become such a burden that they are priced correctly, or is that ever going to happen?
Yeah, that's also a political question, of course. I mean, technically it is easy to imagine that you can increase the price by calculating all these costs, and true pricing is a method that is already applied and to a certain degree also experimented with in the system of national accounting, in the environmental accounts that are satellite accounts to the main accounts. But I think, yeah, at the moment you can't push for it any further because there's too much political opposition to that. The interest of the private sector that are owners and investors, they will hinder that. So technically it's possible, and it would reveal the true cost. I think, yeah, maybe that has an effect on public opinion, maybe, or on grassroots movement. I don't know. But yeah, at the moment the private sector is just too powerful to oppose that.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And the only thing I would add to that is obviously it's a completely distributional question, right? Which is like if those costs, externality costs, are already being felt in many parts of the world, but they're just not being felt in the parts of the world where they would be factored into political decisions. If it was parts of the US that were sinking because of sea level rise, then yeah. And if the people with political power and political influence were being affected in the way other parts of the world are, then of course they would be factored in, but they're not.
I think we have to close the questions now on this optimistic note. Thank you so much, everyone, for your presentation and for your questions. And yeah, there are books being sold, so stick around.